You ever wonder why some rooms and spaces just feel right, even if you can't explain why? Well, it often comes down to the way that furniture and items in those spaces are grouped. And so in this video, I want to explain the 3-5-7 rule, which helps you style surfaces, shelves, and spaces with balance and intention using the power of odd numbers. And why odd numbers? Well, it's because your eye naturally moves better across asymmetry. It feels casual, natural, and lived in, not stiff like a showroom. So whether you're styling a nightstand, a gallery wall, or a console table, the 3-5-7 rule gives you a framework that always works and never looks overdone. Now, in the small chance that you've heard of the 3-5-7 rule before, you've probably heard all three components talked about together. But I actually want to go a little deeper and break down each component individually. So let's look at how each of the three works and where you want to use them. So let's start off with the rule of 3. And we're talking about odd numbers here because they just feel natural and balanced. And 3 specifically is just right. It works across all scales, so things like shelving, walls, lighting, and even furniture. And the best trios mix height, shape, and texture for contrast, and you can use it to add rhythm without the clutter. So anything from a nightstand to a full ceiling. And so in the images I'm about to show you, you're going to notice that it feels natural, but it doesn't feel overdone. Nothing about these rooms screams the number 3, but it just keeps things grounded without feeling like this is too intentional. So, okay, the first image here is the coffee table, right? We've got 3 objects and they've got 3 different functions. We've got a sculptural vase, this small bowl, and a book, and they're all different in purpose and shape, but because of that, they're perfectly balanced. They've got that height, shape, and texture contrast I mentioned a minute ago, because one of them is tall and round, one of them is flat and round, and one of them is wide and rectangular. So nothing is repeating, and at the same time, nothing is clashing either. The materials here feel warm and cohesive because we're using stone, ceramic, paper, all of them in soft and earthy tones that match the rest of the room's palette. And so this feels curated instead of feeling cluttered because there's only 3 items, but the table still feels styled and complete. And that's the power of the rule of 3 when it's done correctly. Okay, now in this second image, we've got these 3 woven pendants over this beautiful dining area, and you can see that they are a natural texture anchor in this space. This woven material breaks up these hard lines of the window grids and the ceiling slats that you see, and because they're grouped in 3, they feel intentional, like some sort of floating installation. And I have to comment on the vertical impact that these lights have, because this is a really tall space, and so having 3 lights hung at different levels makes the most of that height without overpowering it. As you can imagine, when things get dim in here, these lights, because they're hung at slightly different levels, they're going to reflect and just emit light in different ways, which is going to create a bit of a unique feel in that space that you wouldn't get if they were all hung at the same level. And speaking of levels, in this image, we've got 3 items that sit at 3 distinctly different levels. So the lamp, the plant, and the tiny brass bowl on this nightstand, they all sit at different heights, which creates balance without relying on symmetry. Then there's a mix of textures and tones. We've got hard metal, the soft greenery of the plant, and this warm wood, which all play nicely together without blending into each other. And so I would describe this little vignette as having just enough without having too much, because these 3 pieces pretty much fill the space, but they don't overcrowd anything. And if you look closely, you can see that there's a bit of a visual triangle at play, right? The tallest piece, the lamp, is slightly off center, and then the others taper down from that, which guides the eye naturally without feeling too overdone or obvious. And then in this space, we've got these 3 identical vertical mirrors, which bring a bit of structure and balance to this home gym. And even though the mirrors are evenly spaced, having that space between them creates a little bit of separation so that when you're moving around the space, it gives it just a little bit more dynamicity, a little bit more dynamicness in the space, which is perfect when you're doing all this movement in a place like a home gym. Now, unlike the other spaces we looked at so far, there is a little bit of symmetry going on here. Obviously with the 3 mirrors themselves, but also with the windows on the neighboring wall. But the other thing I want to point out here is that these aren't just beautiful, they're also functional. Because given that this is a home gym, you want to have mirrors in there, but these ones specifically feel more like art installations rather than the standard wall mirror that you find at most gyms. Okay, things are heating up here, but let's move on now to the rule of 5. So the rule of 5 is what designers use when they want a space to feel styled, but not necessarily minimal, but also not cluttered either. So if 3 items feels airy and sculptural, then 5 brings a little more personality to a space. And so having 5 objects gives you slightly more room to style without looking messy, and it generally works for a little bit of larger areas, so large console tables, dining tables, and shelving. So you definitely still need variety when it comes to height, texture, and scale, so 5 of the same thing just doesn't cut it. But you can think of this as a little bit more of casual abundance, which is styled but not overdone. So let's look at a few examples. In this first one, we've got the rule of 5 used with restraint, right? Hopefully you can see on this long table behind the couch here, we've got 2 lamps, a candle sitting on top of a book, and a centerpiece tray, but they're all spaced with a good amount of breathing room. And so in this specific space, we've got a little bit of repetition with the anchors on each side, those being the matching lamps, but then the center group of 3 breaks that symmetry just enough to make the space still feel interesting. Now, this second example feels really organic and cozy. Again, we've got 5 tabletop objects, so the vase, the 2 candle holders, the bowl, and a bit of a fabric detail here, and they're all clustered in the center of the table. So they're grouped tightly on this round surface to keep it grounded and make things not look scattered. And then all of that is balanced with this beautiful curved bench in the back. And so the styling mirrors this soft enclosed space, and nothing sticks out too much visually. Now, this table is slightly different. Again, it's using the rule of 5 with these 3 stacked books, this sculptural vase, and the floral arrangement. But if you look just a little bit deeper, you recognize that the round items on the table, so the floral arrangement and the vase, echo the curves of the table itself and also the curved edges on this stool, which helps keep everything visually unified. And in terms of the item placement here, it's balanced and relaxed. There is enough space between the items to avoid visual tension, but it also feels easy and welcoming, as if this would be a natural space that just occurred on its own. And then in this image, you can see the rule of 5 in play across the top shelf here. So we've got 5 distinct items in different sizes and materials. So this tall sculptural piece, another floral arrangement, 2 books of different sizes, and this metallic art object on the left side. But what's important here is that the negative space balances all of this out. So the bold shapes of the shelving add a little bit of rhythm to the entire space, and so the styling itself doesn't need to be loud. And in my view, I would say this looks pretty playful as opposed to looking busy, because each piece feels intentional and well spaced, so it just feels styled instead of being cluttered. But what if you're styling a larger area, like console tables, long shelves, or just a wide entryway? In that case, 3 or 5 items is just going to feel too little. And that's where the rule of 7 comes in. Because having 7 objects gives you more visual interest and movement, while things can still feel intentional. And so the key is to vary the scale, shape, and spacing rather than just lining up 7 matching items. So the way I like to think of this is like music. You need highs, lows, pauses, and rhythm all together to make this work. But when it's done well, the rule of 7 keeps your eye moving across the space without any single object dominating the entire scene. Okay, so the first example here, you can see that there are 7 distinct items. We've got this tall vase with the branches on the left, 2 framed pieces of art, a round bowl, some sort of low sculpture, this flat log in the middle, and a stacked disc, so 7 completely different forms. Now, what I find interesting here is that these items are actually grouped in 2s and 3s, which form invisible triangles that guide your eye across the entire setup. And there's also a lot of texture on texture layering going on here. You can see we've got rough pottery, glass, and natural wood, which all contrast beautifully against the stone wall behind them. And overall, it's balanced, but also dynamic. You know, as you can see, nothing looks too perfectly placed, and there's certainly no symmetry going on here, so the arrangement feels organic and full without feeling messy. Now, next example, there's also 7 objects here, and they're pretty loosely spaced across this desk. We've got this lamp sculpture, the stack of 2 books, the bowl on top of another book with a ceramic sculpture, and this other sort of sculpture on the right. But there's a clear height and shape contrast between all of these items. So some of them are stacked, some of them are more artistic, some of them are round, others are vertical, and none of them repeat each other too closely. But if I would bring in an 8th object here, it would be this piece of art on the wall above them, because it gives the entire space a bit of structure, so the 7 items below don't feel too chaotic. And so in my view, this space feels really personal as opposed to feeling styled. You know, these books and objects feel like they were collected by the owner of this space, maybe from their travels around the world, but still they follow a clear rhythm and they all work well together. And then in this third image, which appears to be the entryway to someone's home, it's a little bit different because we are talking about 7 of the same items, which are these framed photographs or pieces of art. But where things get a little bit more visually interesting here is the mix of orientations. You know, some of them are vertical, some of them are horizontal, and others are square, which creates this natural movement and makes things interesting for the eye. There's also variety in the frames. Some of them are gold, some are wood, and others are neutral tones, which add depth to the space without completely clashing together. But at least the way that I see this space is that they're anchored around this center line, which creates symmetry without being completely rigid or boring. And even the art within these frames varies quite a lot. Some of them are floral, some of them are portraits, some are sketches, and it just gives contrast in the subject, not just in the size of the items themselves. And so overall, all 7 of these pieces are well spaced, but also cohesive. So they've each got their own breathing room, but nothing feels disconnected from the whole. And so if there's one thing you can take away from all this, it's that the best interiors don't just look good, they actually flow. And the 3-5-7 rule is one of the easiest ways to create that flow, even in the tiniest, most insignificant corners of your home. You can use the rule of 3 for simple sculptural styling, the rule of 5 when you want personality without too much clutter, and the rule of 7 to build rhythm across larger spaces. You don't need to follow these rules perfectly, but once you know how they work, then you're going to start seeing them everywhere. And most importantly, you'll start using it without even having to think about it. So this is just styling made simple, and in my view, it's surprisingly powerful. Anyway, I hope this dive into a little bit of the philosophy and psychology behind design has helped you to understand your space and other spaces a little bit deeper. So if you like videos like this, drop this one a like, and I hope you'll check out my other videos up here. I'll see you there.